At last, up on YouTube one more time, or once again, I should say, a few more times, hopefully, before the end of the semester. Um, I do apologize for the tardiness of these lectures on feminist literary criticism. I know we talked about it 2 to 3 weeks ago. Some of you in your second paper took a feminist approach to Mrs. Dalloway, and these videos may have helped you when pursuing that or planning and composing those papers. But my hope is that if you choose to revise those papers for your final portfolio, at the very least these lectures may help you as you do that, as you revise your essays, and also as you prepare your reflective introduction to the portfolio. If you'd like to talk about feminist literary criticism in that reflective introduction, hopefully this video lecture will help refresh your memory or will be something that you can work with in conjunction with your notes. So, all right. Okay, so I might just jump right in. Okay. The subject of feminism, feminist literary theory, and literary criticism is a personal one for me. The very first class I took as a graduate student at Northern Michigan University was a course dedicated entirely to feminist theory and feminist literature. Since that was the beginning of my training in criticism and theory at a more professional and professionalized level, I did not fully understand the texts we read until later in my academic career, but nevertheless it has remained an important foundation for me, politically and professionally. That is, as a citizen, a teacher, and a scholar. But before getting to the link between feminism and literary criticism, I think it may be useful to review at length, so this might be a bit of a lengthy review, to review the approaches to literature we have studied thus far. You will recall that in one of my first videos I draw an invisible triangle and to label the corners author, hopefully I'll remember, author, reader, text. This triangle is helpful for clarifying the move from an old criticism of the early 20th century to the new criticism that emerged and spread itself across the United States in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and you will recall continues to be very influential in literature pedagogy, at the very least, if not influential insofar as close reading and textual analysis is still very important for later approaches to literature. But as I ask, and I think maybe even one of my first video lectures, what was old criticism? If new criticism was new in the mid-century, what was the old criticism? On the one hand, a great deal of literary criticism prior to the work of Cleanth Brooks and others tended to focus on the biographical details of authors, that is, on the events of their life, speculating on what events or persons in the author's life accounted for meaning or significance in their literary works. On the other hand, a great deal of literary teaching, and criticism too, aimed to help students appreciate, or readers appreciate, literature. To develop, that is, an appreciation for literature, and how literature appeals to their common humanity, and I'm going to put that in scare quotes, right? Recall, mostly because later approaches to literature will call into question what a common humanity even looks like, right? Recall Parker's anecdote. Parker, right, the author of our textbook. Recall Parker's anecdote of the 1930s Yale classroom. The professor asking students to write about a time in their own lives when they felt the way Romeo feels about Juliet. The assumption here, of course, is that Romeo is the main subject of sympathetic interest and identity, and not Juliet, or any of the other characters, and that all the students in the room must have had, since they are human in fundamentally identical ways, similar experiences or emotions to those Shakespeare captures in his tragedy. Note that the two methods of approaching literature here tend to focus on the corners I have put at the bottom of my invisible triangle, right? The author, I think, author, or was it author? I can't remember. Author, reader, whatever. Bottom of the triangle. New criticism challenges the idea that consideration of the author or his biography, I say his, since most works considered by new critics tend to be written by men, should ground the work of the literary critic, meaning new critics challenge the notion that a consideration of the author's life should constitute some sort of primary evidence for what a work of literature means. Moreover, they challenge the idea that the author's conscious intentions should serve as the telos, or the endpoint, for what we determine the work to mean. New criticism also challenges the notion that we should ground our interpretations of a work of literature on how it makes us feel, right? On our own feelings, or on how it impresses itself upon us, whether it becomes our favorite poem or not, whether we think it is the greatest English poem about happiness or love or sadness or war or not. William K. Wimsatt and Monroe C. Beardsley co-authored 2 papers that generally serve as the foundational refutations of criticism or pedagogy that focuses on figuring out the intention of the author or grounding readings in the feelings or personal preferences of the reader. The 2 articles are aptly and respectively titled The Intentional Fallacy and The Affective Fallacy. For more on these, you should check out Parker's textbook, pages 30 to 37. While the new critics successfully refocused literature pedagogy on what is now called close reading, a practice that generally survives as a major component in all subsequent approaches to literary criticism and scholarship, there were major theoretical and philosophical problems with it that were eventually challenged by literary critics influenced by structuralism. While new criticism might be very good at developing intricate readings of literary works, usually poems, and convincing accounts of how the tensions and ambiguities of a work resolve themselves into a complex but unified meaning, it, that is, new criticism, does not offer a theory of how literature makes that meaning. Why does literature seem to have a kind of extra meaningfulness, right? That sort of extra layer of significance that ordinary language does not. This is the sort of question that inspires many structuralist literary theorists, many of whom aim to give an account of the grammar of literature, or grammar of literary meaning, an account of the system of relations according to which a literary text appears and appeals to us as a literary text. Remember what Jonathan Culler has written, right? I think I went over this quote earlier. Quote, "The work has structure and meaning because it is read in a particular way. Because these potential properties latent in the object itself are actualized by the theory of discourse applied by the reader in the act of reading. Anyone lacking a training in this discourse would, for example, be quite baffled if presented with a poem. His knowledge of the language would enable him to understand phrases and sentences. In other words, he'd be literate, so he could, read the poem out loud. Literally, pronounce the words, read the poem out loud. But he would not know quite literally," Culler goes on to write, "what to make of this strange concatenation of phrases. He would be unable to read it as literature." It is the account of this underlying literary discourse, which is a cultural discourse, one that we are trained into from being infants, being children, going through school, becoming couch potatoes, watching television and movies, right? It's a discourse that we're sort of trained into, right? And it's this discourse that Seymour Chapman aims to give a theoretical account of in his book, Story and Discourse. In his chapter on events, which we read earlier in the semester, though we didn't sadly have much time to discuss it, Chapman does not aim to produce readings of literary and cinematic works in the way someone like Cleanth Brooks would. Right? He is not interested in resolving inner tensions or ambiguities of the works he cites into a complex interpretation, rather using various literary and cinematic works as mere examples. He maps out a system, a large system of codes, conventions, and logics pertaining to events that all narratives and all plotting, or that is, all plots, share. Whether those plots are cinematic, again, or literary, traditional or experimental, realist or modernist, or postmodernist. When he references Mrs. Dalloway, for instance, I don't know if you'll recall this reference, it's only a few pages long, he is more interested in showing or disclosing a thread of continuity between Woolf's novel and Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. That, namely, that a notion of narrative rhythm, a determinant notion of narrative rhythm, is at work in both works. In Austen's novel, this rhythm constitutes an oscillation between and a distribution of what Chapman calls summary and scene. That is, on the one hand, summary, pure descriptive passages of houses, landscapes, character mindsets, etc., and on the other, scenes, which we can call events or actions involving the characters. Okay, so there's an oscillation between these in a normal plot, or we should say a realist plot. Okay. In Woolf's novel, the rhythm is different, but it still constitutes an oscillation and distribution. Quote, this is Chapman, "The modernist rhythm of Mrs. Dalloway is not an oscillation between summary and scene, but a rhythm of scenes alone, a passing of the story's relay baton from one character to another, even when they do not know each other, but simply materialize in each other's unconscious proximity." End quote. Or, as I put it in an article of my own, which was published in 2009, quote, "The first section of Mrs. Dalloway trains readers to follow two sets of oscillatory movements, back and forth between its narrator and Clarissa's stream of consciousness, as well as within this stream, between Clarissa's present reflections and perceptions and her remembrances of things past." End quote. Regardless of how one says it, rhythm for Chapman is one of the key components of the grammar or underlying structure of all narrative and all plot. Right? We understand Mrs. Dalloway if we come to understand or become trained into understanding the kinds of rhythms at work in her novels, just as we are just by growing up in a certain culture better trained to follow the rhythms of a novel like Pride and Prejudice. Okay. Other narrative components include, for Chapman, sequence, motivation, suspense, time distinction, and so on, all of which he associates primarily with plotting. Okay. He has other chapters on character and other elements of fiction that are familiar to us. But this mapping of literary grammar is really only one version of a literary structuralism. There is another that looks a bit more like new criticism, that is interested in providing a singular account of what and how a work of literature means something. The Natalia Wright's 1946 article, which we read very early in the semester, predates the influence of structuralism in the United States. She nevertheless gives a very structural account of how Woolf generates meaning in her experimental novel. Rather than composing a novel according to the usual conventions of narrative, setting, character, plot, so on, we should, as Woolf's readers, according to Wright, understand meaning in the novel as emerging from and developing among a set of interrelated elements, 4 character groups, 4 psychological states, 4 color schemes, all organized carefully according to a complex distribution of narrative, space, and time. The Septimus group, which I think just includes Rhesia, I might be wrong about that, for instance, corresponds to the psychological theme of self-annihilation, and to the color red. Moreover, he has a significantly strange relationship to the distribution of space and time. Hold on a second, I'll be right back. Sorry about that. So I'm going to go back a few sentences. Um, so recall the septimist group in Natalia Wright's article corresponds to the psychological theme of self-annihilation and to the color red. Moreover, he, or rather this group of characters, has a significantly strange relationship to the distribution of space and time in the novel, since his character group is the narrative focus for the fewest number of literal hours, even though he takes up a great deal of narrative space. In other words, the plotted pace of the forward movement of time in Mrs. Dalloway's story slows when the narrator focuses on Septimus, and the plotted pace then speeds up as we move around and consider other characters in the novel from the novel's narrative perspective. Structuralists might also give an account of literary meaning by describing a system of interrelated binary oppositions that structure the meaning of a work of literature. That is, a set of binary oppositions that are the very condition of the work's meaning. Though she is a psychoanalytically oriented critic, Elizabeth Abel also sets up a structuralist reading of Mrs. Dalloway, insofar as her interpretation maps out a whole set of binary oppositions that she reads as being in direct relation to one another. The binaries present-past, masculine-feminine, urban-pastoral, Oedipal, pre-Oedipal serve as the basis for the internal struggle and complexity of Clarissa Dalloway. Throughout her life, according to Abel, she, that is Clarissa, has teetered back and forth between these binaries, between the terms of these binaries, never quite occupying one in preference over the other. She seems to occupy London and Burton, the Oedipal and the pre-Oedipal, the present and the past, the urban and the pastoral, a desire for men and a desire for women. When she is told the news of Septimus's death, however, according to Abel, another binary is added to this structural grid, a binary that makes possible a shift from Clarissa's state of confusion in between these binary terms to a certain alignment with each of the first terms. The new binary opposition that emerges is life and death. Life is associated with the present, urban, masculine, Oedipal space of London, death with the past, pastoral, feminine, pre-Oedipal space of Burton. According to Abel, these new associations make it much easier for Clarissa to leave behind that which she will never fully retrieve anyway, that is, Burton, her love of Sally Seton, the past, and to embrace instead, and more fully, her present life, however imperfect its pleasures may be. This summary of Abel's argument does not do full justice, of course, to the intricacy of her reading or to the ways in which she positions Woolf and Freud with and against one another, but it does suggest a second way to pursue a structuralist reading. That is, to map out the sets of interrelated terms, either binary, tripartite, or quadripartite, that structure our perception and our understanding of how a work of literature makes meaning. Deconstruction as a philosophy and a mode of reading texts begins, not works, but texts, begins to have and influence the United States around the same time as structuralism. I won't delve too deeply here into the ideas of Jacques Derrida, but I will say that deconstruction offers a lens or an optic, or a tool, with which to challenge the structures or systems that structuralism sets up as a grammar of whatever meaning is being studied. So whether it's Chapman's structure of all narrative, or whether it's Wright's or Abel's structure of meaning in particular relation to Mrs. Dalloway. For a review of the tropes of deconstructive literary criticism that aims to play with and indeed to betray the codes and conventions of typical interpretation, see Lecture 4.4. And when it comes to binary oppositions, deconstructive criticism aims to show that binary terms are never neutral or simply binarized. They are a hierarchy, one always being privileged over the other, or most of the time being privileged over the other. But, and this is Derrida's main point, that hierarchy is unstable. So while Abel makes an argument that the life-death opposition makes Clarissa's choice of the present over the past easier, J. Hillis Miller, as we have seen, makes a much messier point, that the connections associated with the life side of the binaries in Mrs. Dalloway are a ruse, that the only true connections that are possible, again according to Mrs. Dalloway and Miller's treatment of it, are through death. See Lecture 4.2 for more on this argument. When we look to Toril Moy's book chapter on Woolf, it's not on Mrs. Dalloway, but just on Woolf, which we discussed 2, maybe 3 weeks ago now. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. We also see the adoption of a deconstructive outlook, when she challenges the very notion of the gender distinction Abel takes for granted. The division masculine-feminine or man-woman, in other words, is not natural. It is not disinterested. It is part, she argues, of the very ideological system that is patriarchy, that feminism as a mode of critique and a mode of doing politics aims to undermine, attack, subvert, and potentially bring to an end or transform. In Woolf, Moy sees a deconstructive operation at work long before Derrida ever published his first works. For Woolf, in Moy's words, quote, exposes the way in which language refuses to be pinned down to an essential meaning. Through her conscious exploitation of the sportive, sensual nature of language, Woolf rejects the metaphysical essentialism underlying patriarchal ideology, which hails God, the Father, or the phallus as its transcendental signified. End quote. Under this approach to Woolf, that is Woolf's, quote, crucial concept of androgyny, end quote, which we as readers might observe in the character of Clarissa, but also in Septimus, I'll get to him later, quote, is not a flight from fixed gender identities, but a recognition of their falsifying metaphysical nature, end quote. A deconstructive feminism would not, as in Abel, map out or mark signs with literature, or mark signs within literature as masculine or feminine, but instead would try to hold that distinction in suspension, tease out moments in which that distinction is consciously or unconsciously broken down, or exposed as constructed, right? It is this very work of suspension that deconstruction aims to achieve, disclosing it in the textual practice of an author or in the kind of critical and strategic perversion of the text that the critic is studying. Either way, deconstruction, like new criticism and structuralism, is very interested in the text, right, at the top of our triangle. These three approaches may be very different, may exhibit different attitudes toward meaning, but they are very involved with the problem of what the work is doing, how it makes meaning, or how we can make meaning of it. My use of Elizabeth Abel and Toril Moy, however, a psychoanalyst, a feminist, should suggest a change that is happening now, that we are well on our way into our later units. In fact, we're well on our way toward the end of the semester. We only have 2 more classes left. 1 more after tomorrow's class. What is this change? That though an interest in the text at the top of our triangle is still a major component of approaches like psychoanalytic and feminist literary criticism, that they also have concerns, concepts, ideas, purposes, and values that we might call extra-textual. Equipped with the insights of structuralism and or deconstruction, these literary critics do not only address the thematic meaning of literary works, but address issues as diverse as sexual development, identity or identities, repression and sublimation, the history of patriarchal violence, gender performance, rape culture, power, cultural norms, representation and misrepresentation, mental illness, various states of oppression, and processes of sexualization, normalization, and naturalization. This list is far from exhaustive, but it should illustrate that the approaches we are studying are far more than methods of reading. They are also, as I have stated several times, clusters of competing and collaborative and evolving critical, political, and theoretical concerns, concepts, ideas, activities, positions, challenges, etc. Since I covered psychoanalysis in the videos I posted, 2 weeks ago now? My goodness. I'll leap over it for now. Suffice it to say that a great deal of feminist feminist theory and criticism positions itself with and against psychoanalysis, given Freud's complex legacy in regard to how we understand gender and sexuality. On the one hand, he argues that we are born into a kind of polymorphous perversity, neither one gender nor one sex or sexuality. On the other hand, he does have clear values pertaining to healthy or normal modes of being a gendered, sexed human being versus unhealthy and abnormal modes of being a gendered, sexed human being. In the next video, I will move directly into the relationship between feminism and literary criticism.